On the 20th anniversary of the company born from my mind and my inheritance, my son stood on a brightly lit stage and called the business plan. I wrote all 50 pages of it, quaint but naive. So the next morning, I made a single phone call to my lawyer and gave him a simple instruction: activate everything. After all, it was my $75, 000, and my 4 patented recipes that formed the bedrock of the empire he was now trying to steal from me in front of 200 people. The applause felt distant, a soft, pointless rhythm like rain against a window pane. I didn't hear the individual claps. I heard only the echo of his words, bouncing around the vast, hollow space that had just opened up inside my chest. Quaint, but naive. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of sugar and success, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of my throat. For 2 decades, that scent had been my pride. Now, it was the smell of my own erasure. My son, Kevin, was still on stage, beaming under the warm, golden lights. He looked so handsome in his tailored suit, the one Amber had insisted he buy for the occasion. She stood beside him, her hand possessively on the small of his back, her smile a perfect, predatory curve of crimson lipstick. She was the artist, and my son was her masterpiece of sculpted ambition. I watched her gaze sweep over the crowd of investors, franchisees, and journalists, a silent queen surveying her new domain. Then, for a fraction of a second, her eyes met mine. There was no triumph in them. Not yet. Just a flicker of dismissive pity, the kind one gives to a piece of old furniture that no longer fits the decor. I didn't move. My spine was a rod of steel against the plush velvet of the chair. My hands rested in my lap, one folded over the other, perfectly still. A lifetime of practice had taught me that the most powerful response is often no response at all. To show pain is to cede control. I would not give them that satisfaction. Kevin was laughing now, sharing an anecdote about their first real marketing push. Mom had this wonderful homespun idea of putting flyers in the local library, he said, his voice dripping with condescending affection. It was sweet, but Amber, she saw the bigger picture. She knew our brand wasn't about a single town. It was about a global palette. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it was almost impressive. I remembered the nights I'd spent at my kitchen table, a single lamp cutting through the darkness, drafting the initial 5-year growth strategy. It wasn't about flyers in a library. It was about securing supplier chains, calculating profit margins on 4 signature products, and identifying 3 adjacent zip codes for scalable expansion. It was a plan built not on dreams, but on mathematics. The math I'd learned during 30 years as an accountant, a profession I'd left, to build this legacy for him, for my son. A waiter moved silently past our table, refilling champagne flutes. He reached for mine, but I placed a single finger on the rim of the glass, stopping him. The champagne remained untouched, its bubbles rising and dying in a tiny, silent ballet. The celebration was over. I just hadn't realized it until now. The glass was cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the flush of cold fire spreading through my veins. It was not the heat of anger, it was the chill of absolute clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a fog of sentimentality is burned away by a betrayal so profound, it leaves behind nothing but hard, unassailable truth. And it's with that forward-thinking vision, Kevin continued, his voice swelling with practiced sincerity, that Amber and I took that initial charming little bakery and transformed it into the franchise empire we celebrate tonight. To my wife, the true co-founder of ELEANOR'S finest, the name of the company, my name, felt like a foreign word in his mouth, a relic he was forced to acknowledge before burying it completely. The applause erupted again, louder this time, for Amber, the usurper. She curtsied slightly, a gesture of faux humility that was more arrogant than any speech. I let my gaze drift from the stage to the man sitting beside me, Mr. Alden. He hadn't touched his champagne either. His hands, wrinkled with the same 70-odd years as mine, were steepled on the table. He was a man made of contracts and consequences, and his face was a mask of grim neutrality. But I saw it. The tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes, which had known me since before Kevin was born, had turned from the warm gaze of an old friend to the cold, focused stare of a litigator. He had been there from the beginning. He was the one who read my 50-page plan and didn't call it quaint. He called it ironclad. He was the one who, 20 years ago, had looked at me over a stack of incorporation documents and said, "Eleanor, protect your foundation. Sentiment is for family. Patents and trademarks are for business." I had listened. I had registered the master recipes. I had retained ownership of the brand name's intellectual property. I had structured the operating agreement so that I handed over management, but not the soul of the company. It was all there, filed away in his quiet downtown office, a sleeping arsenal. Kevin and Amber were descending the stage now, walking through the crowd like conquering heroes. People were reaching out to shake their hands, congratulating them. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a film of someone else's life. The woman who had poured her inheritance, her time, her very essence into this business was a ghost at her own celebration. They hadn't just taken credit, they had erased my existence. They thought my silence over the years was weakness. My choice to step back was a sign of naivety. They had mistaken my love for a lack of foresight. It was a fatal miscalculation. My eyes met Mr. Alden's across the small space between us. The noise of the room faded into a dull roar. There was only his steady, questioning gaze. He was waiting. He had been waiting for 10 years, ever since Amber had entered the picture and the slow, insidious process of rewriting history had begun. He saw the shift in me. He saw the quiet pride of the last hour curdle into something cold and hard and final. I gave him the smallest of nods, a dip of my chin so minuscule that no one else in the room could have possibly noticed. It wasn't a gesture of defeat. It wasn't an admission of pain. It was an instruction. It was the turning of a key. Mr. Alden's expression didn't change, but I saw the understanding in his eyes. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table, a silent confirmation. The agreement was made. The long game I had been playing, the contingency plan I had hoped I would never need, was now in effect. The Grossmeister had just moved her queen. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up my untouched champagne flute. The weight of it felt significant now. It was no longer a drink for a celebration, but an artifact from a life that had just ended. I didn't drink it. I simply held it for a moment, then placed it back on the white linen tablecloth. The click of the crystal base against the table was quiet, precise, and absolute, like the sound of a vault door swinging shut. The game was over. It was time to present the invoice. The drive home was a silent, 20-minute transition between two worlds. I left their world of blinding spotlights, hollow applause, and the cloying, sugary scent of a victory they hadn't earned. I returned to mine, a world of quiet order, the scent of lemon oil on polished wood, and the unyielding certainty of facts. I parked the car in the garage with my usual precision, the bumper a perfect 6 inches from the wall. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the only sound in the stillness. Inside, the house was dark save for the moonlight filtering through the tall windows of the foyer, casting long, geometric shadows on the marble floor. I didn't turn on the lights. I'd always been able to navigate this house by heart. It was, after all, a space I had designed and built with the first significant profits from the bakery, long before Amber had ever entered the picture. Each corner, each threshold, was a part of my own personal blueprint. I didn't go to the kitchen for a glass of water, nor to the living room to sink into a comfortable chair. There was no fatigue, no wave of grief threatening to crash over me. The shock I'd felt in that ballroom had already crystallized into something harder, colder, and infinitely more useful: purpose. My steps were steady on the oak staircase, my hand barely grazing the smooth, cool wood of the banister. My destination was my study, my sanctuary, my armory. The study was at the back of the house, overlooking the garden I had meticulously cultivated for 30 years. It was a room of dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled not with novels, but with volumes on business law, economics, and agricultural history. It was a room of substance, not sentiment. On the far wall, between two towering bookshelves, was a large, unassuming painting of a serene coastline. A pleasant piece, but its true function was concealment. My fingers found the hidden latch on the frame. The painting swung inward noiselessly on well-oiled hinges, revealing the flat, gray steel door of a wall safe. The combination was not a birthday or an anniversary. It was the date the first corporate bank account for ELEANOR'S Finest was opened, an account I had funded myself. My fingers, steady and sure, turned the dial. Left, right, left. The tumblers clicked into place with a sound of satisfying finality, a sound I hadn't heard in years. The heavy door swung open. The contents were sparse: a few pieces of heirloom jewelry, my parents' wedding rings, my own will, and at the very bottom, lying flat, was a thick burgundy leather portfolio. The gold-embossed lettering on the cover was simple, elegant, and stark: Project Legacy. I lifted it from the safe. It was heavy, weighted with the truth of the last 2 decades. Closing the safe, I swung the painting back into place, restoring the room's serene facade. No one would ever know the arsenal that lay behind it. My desk was a large, uncluttered expanse of polished mahogany. I switched on the green banker's lamp, and a pool of focused light illuminated the surface, pushing the shadows to the corners of the room. I placed the portfolio in the center of that light and untied the silk ribbon holding it closed. The scent of old paper and leather, a smell of permanence and history, rose to meet me. I opened it. This was not a scrapbook of memories. This was an arsenal of facts. One by one, I laid the contents out on the desk, arranging them not with nostalgia, but with the strategic precision of a general laying out his battle plans. First, the original business plan. It was 52 pages long, typed on my old Smith Corona. The ink still a crisp, dark black against the thick, cream-colored bond paper. The edges were slightly softened with time, but the document was pristine. I ran my fingers over the cover page. ELEANOR'S Finest, a 5-year plan for scalable artisanal baking. And beneath it, my name. Eleanor Vance, no one else's. I flipped through the pages: financial projections, supply chain logistics, market analysis, branding strategy. And in the margins, my own neat cursive handwriting in blue ink annotations, calculations, questions I had posed to myself in the dead of night. Query wholesale butter suppliers is a 3% cost reduction feasible with a 12-month contract, on page 17. Phase 2 expansion. Focus on Town B, higher median income, less market saturation, on page 34. Quaint but naive. The words echoed in my mind, but now they were utterly absurd. A child's crayon drawing laid next to an architectural schematic. This document was the steel framework upon which everything was built, Next to it, I placed the bank transfer receipt, a fragile carbon copy slip from 20 years ago, carefully preserved in an acid-free sleeve. The date was clear. The amount, printed in the dot matrix font of the era, was undeniable: $75,000. Transferred from my personal savings account, the inheritance my parents had left me, to the newly formed corporate entity. It was the seed from which their multi-million-dollar empire had grown, not a loan, an investment, the founding capital. I stared at the number, not as a monument to my sacrifice, but as Exhibit A in a case of grand larceny. Then came the heart of the matter: 4 separate documents, each bearing the official seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. These were the patents for the 4 original recipes: the Governor's chocolate cake, Sunrise lemon tart, the Harvest apple pie, Midwinter cranberry scone, my creations. I had spent 6 months perfecting each one, tweaking ingredient ratios by the gram, documenting every step, every temperature, every variable. Mr. Alden had insisted on this. Your recipes are not just instructions, Eleanor. He had told me all those years ago. They are intellectual property. They are assets. Protect them as you would protect the deed to your house. So I had. These weren't Mom's recipes. They were legally protected, proprietary formulas, owned by me, licensed to the company. A license, I recalled with a cold smile, that was revocable. Finally, I laid out the most crucial document of all, the original trademark registration for the name, ELEANOR'S Finest. The certificate was heavy, embossed, official. It stated in unequivocal legal terms that the trademark, the brand, the very name they had celebrated tonight, was the sole and exclusive property of Eleanor Vance. I had given my son the right to operate the business, to grow it, to be its public face. I had never, ever signed over the ownership of its soul. The 4 documents and the business plan lay on my desk in a neat row, a silent, irrefutable narrative of creation, my creation. Just then, a soft chime cut through the silence of the room. My phone, which I'd placed on the corner of the desk, lit up. The screen displayed a text message from Kevin. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I tapped to open it. Mom, hope you're proud of me. Sorry you left so early. I read the words once, then a second time. There was no malice in them, only a profound, bottomless, and insulting ignorance. He wasn't goading me. He genuinely didn't understand what he had done. In his mind, the story he and Amber had crafted had become the truth. He had erased me so completely from the narrative that he could no longer even see my ghost. He saw my quiet departure not as the first strategic retreat in a declaration of war, but as the pouting of an old woman who couldn't stay up late. He was asking for my pride in the very act of my annihilation. I felt nothing. No anger, no surge of pain. The emotional wound had been cauterized on the spot by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his speech. This text was merely a sprinkle of salt on a scar that had already formed. It changed nothing. It merely confirmed the necessity of my next move. This wasn't about a wounded mother lashing out at her ungrateful son anymore. It was about a founder protecting her assets from a dangerously incompetent CEO who had been compromised by a hostile actor. I switched the phone off and set its screen down on the desk. The digital world of their perceptions and their lies could wait. My world was here, in the pool of light from my lamp, in the tangible, legally binding reality of these papers. My reflection in the dark window showed a woman I barely recognized. Not a baker, not a mother. It was the face of the accountant I used to be, calm, analytical, and utterly implacable. The warm, soft grandmother they thought they knew was gone. In her place sat the architect, the founder, the Grossmeister. I looked down at the documents, my battle map. The pain was gone, the shock was gone. What remained was a cold, pure resolve that settled deep in my bones. There was no satisfaction in it, no glee of impending revenge. There was only the quiet, profound certainty of a necessary correction, a balancing of the books, a restoration of order. Justice wasn't a matter of emotion. It was a matter of execution, and all the instruments for that execution were now laid out before me. My nod to Mr. Alden had been the authorization. This ritual, here in the silence of my study, was the ratification. The decision was made. The long game was over. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Alden would get his call, and the process of dismantling the beautiful, fragile lie my son and his wife had built would begin. It was time to remind them who owned the recipe. Not just for the cakes, but for the entire empire. The sun rose at 6:02 a.m. I know this because I was already awake, sitting in the deep armchair in my study, watching the first pale, gray fingers of dawn stretch across the sky. I had not slept. Sleep felt like an indulgence, an unnecessary surrender when there was work to be done. The leather portfolio, Project Legacy, lay open on my desk, its contents illuminated by the soft glow of the banker's lamp I had left on all night. They were not just documents. They were soldiers, standing at attention, awaiting their orders. My morning routine began, as it always did, with coffee, not with a plastic pod and the push of a button, but with a process. The deliberate act of measuring the dark, oily beans, the high-pitched whir of the grinder that filled the quiet kitchen with the rich, earthy scent of potential, the slow, patient pour of hot water over the grounds. Each step was a small ritual of control, a reminder that the best results come from a methodical and unwavering process. As the dark, fragrant liquid dripped into the carafe, I allowed myself to think of them. I pictured them waking up in their stark white apartment downtown, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked beautiful but was brutally uncomfortable to sit on. Amber would be the first to reach for her phone, her thumb flicking expertly through social media feeds. She would be basking in the digital glow of last night's triumph. Posts from attendees tagging the company, photos of her and Kevin on stage, their faces flushed with success. I could almost hear her voice, a honeyed murmur laced with steel, reading a caption aloud. Power couple at Amber Vance and at Kevin Vance celebrate 20 years of innovation at number ELEANOR'S finest. Innovation. A word used to describe the shiny new packaging she'd designed, not the painstaking chemistry I had perfected in my kitchen 2 decades ago. Kevin would still be half asleep, groggy from the champagne and adoration. He would stumble to their chrome and marble kitchen island, where Amber would have the morning edition of the City Business Journal waiting for him. There would be a photo of them on the front page of the lifestyle section. The headline would be something laudatory and trite, a sweet success story. ELEANOR'S finest celebrates 2 decades of dominance. He would read the article, his chest swelling with a pride he felt he had earned. The journalist, fed a press kit curated by Amber, would have written glowingly of his visionary leadership and her marketing genius. My name, if mentioned at all, would be in a passing historical context. The quaint and naive founder whose charming little hobby had been forged into an empire by true visionaries. He would believe every word. He had been believing it, in increments, for 10 years. Last night was simply the public coronation of a lie he had long ago accepted as truth. The coffee was ready. I poured it into my favorite ceramic mug, a simple, heavy piece of pottery that felt solid and warm in my hands. I didn't add sugar or cream. I wanted the taste to be sharp, black, and unambiguous. Carrying the mug, I returned to the study. The sun was higher now, casting a gentle golden light on the polished floor. It was time. I sat at my desk and pulled the telephone towards me. It was an old landline, a heavy, reassuring object with a coiled cord. I preferred it for important calls. It felt more deliberate, more permanent than a cell phone. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the receiver and dialed the number I knew by heart, the direct line to Mr. Alden's private office. It rang only once. Alden. His voice was gravelly, awake, and alert. There were no pleasantries. He knew this wasn't a social call. I took a sip of my coffee. The bitterness was clarifying. "Mr. Alden," I said, my voice as calm and even as the surface of a still lake. "It is Eleanor." There was a pause on the other end, but it was not one of surprise. It was a pause of acknowledgement, the silence of a loyal soldier finally hearing the long-awaited command. "Eleanor," he replied, his tone shifting from neutral to one of focused readiness. "I've been waiting for your call." "The time has come," I said, looking at the patent certificates spread across my desk. Each one was a declaration of ownership, a fact. "Activate everything." "Activate everything," he repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. There was the sound of a leather chair creaking, the rustle of papers. He was already in motion. "The drafts have been on file for 5 years, updated semi-annually. The cease and desist notices are addressed to the company's board of directors, the CEO, and the chief marketing officer. A separate package is prepared for the legal counsel of your 10 largest franchisees, informing them that the parent company is currently operating in breach of its licensing agreements." My God, he was magnificent, a true grandmaster of his craft. "The timing?" I asked. "Certified couriers will be dispatched within the hour," he said. "The emails, with digitally signed attachments, will be sent concurrently at 9 a.m. sharp. They will receive the news simultaneously, just as they are settling in for their first post-celebration workday. It will be on their desks before they've finished their second cup of coffee." The image was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The quiet, orderly destruction of their triumphant morning. Not a loud, messy explosion, but the silent, efficient work of a virus entering a system. "Consider it done, Eleanor," Mr. Alden said. His voice held the weight of a 20-year promise finally being fulfilled. "The first move has been made. The board is now yours." "Thank you, Mr. Alden," I said, and the line went dead. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft, definitive click. It was done. The mechanism was in motion, an intricate piece of legal clockwork I had commissioned years ago, now ticking inexorably forward. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no flush of victory. I felt a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. I had corrected an error in the system. I took another sip of my coffee and swiveled my chair to face the large window overlooking my garden. The morning mist was burning off the roses. For a moment, I could see Mr. Alden's office in my mind's eye, the mahogany desk, the walls of leather-bound books, the quiet efficiency of his paralegal, already printing the final notices, sealing them in crisp, intimidating envelopes. I saw the courier arriving, signing for the packages. I saw the digital files being queued up, ready to flood the inboxes of people who, at this very moment, believed themselves to be untouchable. They were celebrating a victory on a battlefield they didn't even know existed. They thought the war was one of public perception and marketing spin. They had no idea the real war was one of contracts, patents, and intellectual property law, a war they had lost before they even knew it had been declared. Finishing my coffee, I set the empty mug down on a coaster. The house was silent around me. There was nothing more to do but wait. My part in this initial phase was over. I had given the command. My general was now executing the strategy. I stood up and walked to the French doors that led out into the garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I picked up my gardening shears and my basket from their place by the door and stepped outside. My roses needed tending. There were some dead blooms that needed to be pruned, some overgrown branches that were threatening the healthier parts of the plant. My fingers, clad in worn leather gloves, moved with practiced ease. The sharp snip of the shears was a clean, satisfying sound in the morning quiet. I moved from bush to bush, assessing, trimming, shaping. Pruning is not an act of violence. It is an act of preservation. You cut away the dead and the diseased to allow the living, healthy core to flourish. You sacrifice a few branches to save the entire rose bush. It is a necessary, calculated, and ultimately compassionate act. As I worked, dropping the spent blossoms into my basket, I felt a deep and abiding peace settle over me. I was not a woman scorned. I was not a vengeful mother. I was a gardener, tending to what was mine. And today was just a normal, working morning. I spent the morning in the garden, a place of methodical growth and tangible results. The snip of my shears cutting through a thorny stem was a sound of precise action, each cut a decision made and executed. I filled my basket with pruned branches and spent blooms, clearing the way for new life. The sun warmed my back, a pleasant, steady heat. Here, in this world of soil and thorns and sunlight, there were clear rules. Neglect brought decay. Care brought beauty. Cause and effect were pure and simple. By 10 o'clock, my work was done. I left my gloves and basket on the stone bench and went inside, my hands smelling of earth and roses. I was in the kitchen, washing my hands at the deep farmhouse sink, when the first tremor arrived. My phone, which I had left on the granite countertop, began to vibrate, its insistent buzzing a harsh electronic intrusion into the quiet rhythm of my morning. I dried my hands on a linen towel and glanced at the screen. Kevin, I let it buzz. 4 rings, then silence, then voicemail. I turned the phone face down on the counter, a small, black mirror reflecting nothing. I knew what was happening. At 9 a.m., the emails would have arrived. At 9:05 a.m., there would have been confused whispers in the corporate office. By 9:30 a.m., their in-house legal counsel would have been summoned, and by 10 a.m., the first wave of panic would be reaching the shore. The first move of the game was complete. Now, I would simply observe the opponent's reaction. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, the fragrant steam of bergamot, a soothing counterpoint to the storm I knew was brewing miles away. As the tea steeped, the phone buzzed again, and again. Kevin, Amber. I watched the dark rectangle vibrate against the cool gray stone. It was like watching a captured insect, frantic and powerless, beating itself against the walls of its glass prison. I imagined the scene in their office, a space I had visited only once and found cold and impersonal, all glass walls and gray carpet. Kevin would be pacing, his hand running through his perfectly styled hair, his face a mask of disbelief. The celebratory mood of the morning would have evaporated, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. "It has to be a mistake," I could hear him saying, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "Some kind of clerical error. Mom wouldn't. She couldn't." Amber would be the one to grasp the reality of the situation first. Her marketing-driven mind, so adept at crafting narratives, would be furiously trying to understand this new, hostile one. She would be standing still, her arms crossed, her expression sharp with a fury that was quickly eclipsing her shock. She wouldn't see it as a mistake. She would see it as a declaration of war. The landline on the kitchen wall rang, its shrill, old-fashioned peal cutting through the air. I looked at it, then at the mobile phone on the counter. A coordinated assault. I smiled faintly and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest. Let them ring. My silence was now my most powerful weapon. Every unanswered call, every unread text would amplify their panic. It would deny them the one thing they craved: a confrontation, an emotional outburst, a scene they could twist and manage. They were experts in the currency of emotion and drama. I was removing that currency from the market entirely. The landline stopped. The mobile fell silent. A brief reprieve. I knew it wouldn't last. I took my tea and a book and went to the sunroom, a glass-enclosed space at the back of the house filled with ferns and orchids. I sat in my favorite wicker chair, opened my book, and began to read. The words on the page were a refuge of order and logic. 30 minutes passed. Then the barrage began in earnest. The mobile phone, which I had brought with me and placed on the small glass table, began a relentless, pulsating dance. It was a chaotic symphony of their crumbling reality. First, the texts from Kevin. 10:32 a.m. Mom, call me. Something strange is going on. 10:35 a.m. Did you hire a lawyer? What is this cease and desist nonsense? This is some kind of sick joke. 10:41 a.m. The board is calling me. Franchisees are calling me. They think we don't own our own recipes. Call me now. His tone shifted from confusion to anger. He was a man who had never faced a real crisis, a boy king whose throne was suddenly revealed to be made of cardboard. Then, Amber's texts began. Her approach was different, sharper, more direct. 10:45 a.m. Eleanor, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you are destroying this company. You are destroying your son's life's work. 10:48 a. Did you do this because of the speech? Are you that petty? You are going to bankrupt us out of spite. Our company, his life's work. The audacity was breathtaking. They had written me out of the story so completely that in their minds, my assertion of legal ownership was an act of sabotage, not a rightful claim. I turned a page in my book, my heart rate as steady as a metronome. I was not angry. I was not hurt. I was fascinated. I was an architect watching a stress test on a poorly constructed building. My foundations were sound. It was their glittering, hollow superstructure that was beginning to crack and groan under the first application of real pressure. The phone rang again. Amber. I watched her name flash on the screen. I could almost feel the venom pouring through the receiver, the high-pitched shriek of a usurper whose stolen crown was being lifted from her head. I pressed the volume button on the side of the phone, silencing the ringer. The screen continued to light up, a frantic, silent strobe light. But the house was once again peaceful. Now came the final, predictable phase, the gaslighting. When aggression and demands failed, they would pivot to emotional manipulation. 11:15 a.m. How could you do this to your own family, to your own grandchildren? You're punishing them to get at me. An interesting tactic, using my grandchildren, who wanted for nothing, as human shields. It was weak, and I dismissed it. 11:22 a.m. After everything we've done for you, we gave you a legacy to be proud of. We took your little hobby and made it something real. And this is how you thank us? You were always jealous of what Kevin and I built together. Jealous. The accusation was so ludicrous, so far from the truth, that I almost laughed. They believed the narrative so deeply that they saw my original creation as an attack on their derivative success. They were like tenants in a mansion who had come to believe they had built it, and now saw the landlord arriving with the deed as a personal affront. I finished my chapter, closed the book, and placed it on the table. The phone screen was a logbook of their escalating desperation. I picked it up and scrolled through the messages, my expression as neutral as a judge reading a court docket. These were not the cries of a wounded family. These were the panicked squeals of thieves caught in the act. I thought of Mr. Alden, sitting in his quiet, wood-paneled office. By now, he would have received frantic calls from their corporate attorneys. I could picture him perfectly, leaning back in his leather chair, his voice a calm, implacable baritone. "I'm afraid my client will not be communicating directly," he would say. "All correspondence is to be directed through my office. We can schedule a preliminary meeting to discuss the terms of the licensing violations. I can be available next Thursday." Next Thursday. An eternity for them. A calculated move to let them stew in the poison of their own uncertainty, to let the financial pressure from the franchisees and the board mount to an unbearable level. He was not just my lawyer. He was an extension of my will, a master of the psychological warfare that is the heart of high-stakes negotiation. The emotional storm they were trying to create had failed to make landfall. It was raging somewhere far out at sea, while I remained on my quiet, sunlit island, perfectly untouched. Their words, their accusations, their frantic pleas, they had no power here. They were banging on a door that would not be answered. I stood up, took my empty teacup back to the kitchen, and rinsed it. Looking out the window over the sink, I saw a small, brown sparrow land on the bird feeder I kept filled. It pecked at the seeds, blissfully unaware of the corporate drama unfolding across the city. The world continued its simple, honest rhythm. I picked up my phone one last time. There were 17 missed calls and 34 text messages. I read the last one, from Kevin, 11:50 a.m. "Mom, please, just tell me what you want." Ah, finally. The anger had burned itself out. The manipulations had failed. All that was left was the raw, terrified voice of a man who had just realized he was not in control. He was finally asking the right question. He was no longer telling me what I had done wrong. He was asking for my terms. The game had shifted. He had conceded his position. He just didn't know it yet. I held my thumb over the power button, pressed it, and switched the phone off completely. The screen went black. The silence was now absolute. They didn't need to know what I wanted. They would find out soon enough, on my terms. In a boardroom, with lawyers present, not as a mother to her son, but as a founder to her CEO. A week of silence can be a more powerful force than 1,000 tempests. For 7 days, I let them exist in the vacuum I had created. Their world, once a solid structure of self-congratulation and projected success, had become a house of cards in a hurricane. I knew, from Mr. Alden's brief daily updates, that the pressure was immense. Franchisees were threatening lawsuits. The board of directors was in open revolt. Their carefully constructed narrative had been shattered by the simple, brutal force of legal fact. The meeting was set for Wednesday at 2 p.m., not at their sterile, glass-walled corporate headquarters, but on my ground, in the lion's den. Mr. Alden's office was a fortress of mahogany and leather-bound law books, a place where emotions withered under the cold, dry light of contractual obligation. I chose my armor with care. A tailored suit of charcoal gray wool, a crisp white silk blouse buttoned to the collar, and my late mother's simple pearl earrings. It was the uniform of the woman I had been before I became a mother, before I became a baker, an accountant, a professional, someone for whom numbers and facts were the only language that mattered. My hair was styled in a neat chignon, not a single strand out of place. I was not attending a family squabble. I was attending a corporate execution. I arrived 10 minutes early. Mr. Alden greeted me in the lobby, his expression grim but with a flicker of something akin to pride in his eyes. "They are in conference room B, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "With their counsel. They look diminished." "Good," I said. It was the only word that was necessary. He led me not to the main conference room but to his private office. On his vast, polished desk, 2 stacks of documents were laid out in perfect alignment. Option A and Option B, he said, tapping the first stack. Complete severance. They rebrand within 90 days, cease production of all patented recipes, and publicly retract their previous statements regarding the company's founding. A clean break. He then tapped the second, thicker stack. And Option B, the continuation, with amendments. I looked at the documents, the product of his magnificent legal mind. They were not just contracts, they were instruments of justice. "We will present both," I said, "but we both know which one they will be forced to choose." "Indeed," he said, with a thin, cold smile. "One is a quick death. The other is a lifetime of servitude to the truth." At precisely 2 p.m., we walked down the hushed, carpeted hallway. Mr. Alden opened the door to conference room B, and I stepped inside. The room was large, dominated by a long, polished table that reflected the grim fluorescent lights above. They were already there, seated on the far side, looking small and lost against the backdrop of the imposing room. Their lawyer, a slick, anxious-looking man in a suit a size too tight, sat beside them. Kevin looked hollowed out. The confident, beaming man from the stage was gone, replaced by a pale, haunted version of my son. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he stared at me with a desperate, wounded expression. Amber sat ramrod straight, her face a pale mask of controlled fury. Her crimson lipstick was a slash of defiance in her otherwise colorless face. She would not break, but she was already broken. She just hadn't admitted it to herself yet. I took my seat directly opposite them, the vast expanse of polished wood between us feeling like a chasm. Mr. Alden sat at the head of the table, placing his leather briefcase before him with a soft, authoritative thud. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with resentment and fear. Kevin was the first to speak, his voice cracking. "Mom, Eleanor, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? We're family." Before I could respond, Amber's voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle. "Don't bother, Kevin. She doesn't care about family. This is about jealousy." She couldn't stand to see us succeed. I raised a single hand, a simple gesture that commanded the silence to return. My eyes met Kevin's, then Amber's. They were cold, devoid of the maternal warmth they had taken for granted and abused for 2 decades. "Emotions are irrelevant in this room," I said, my voice calm, measured, and utterly devoid of feeling. "We are not here as a family. We are here as business principals to resolve a series of significant intellectual property infringements." I turned my gaze to Mr. Alden. "Mr. Alden, you may begin." It was a dismissal, a recontextualization of our entire relationship. In that moment, I ceased to be their mother and became their adversary. The shift was palpable. Kevin flinched as if struck. Amber's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching in her cheek. Mr. Alden opened his briefcase and, with the slow, deliberate movements of a master craftsman, laid out the documents. He was the conductor of this execution, and he savored every note. "Let's be clear about the situation," he began, his voice filling the room with an easy authority. "My client, Miss Eleanor Vance, is the sole and exclusive owner of the trademark ELEANOR'S Finest, as well as the patents for the 4 core recipes upon which 92% of your company's gross revenue is based. For the past decade, your company, under the management of Mr. Vance and Miss Vance, has operated under a verbal licensing agreement that was predicated on goodwill. That goodwill has been irrevocably broken." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Their lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "As of 9 a.m. 1 week ago," Mr. Alden continued, "that verbal agreement was formally terminated. Your company is now, and has been for 7 days, in flagrant violation of federal trademark and patent law. Every product you have sold since that moment has deepened your legal and financial liability. My client has 2 proposals to resolve this matter." He slid the first thinner stack of papers across the table. It stopped directly in front of their lawyer. Option A, the dissolution. He outlined the terms with surgical precision. They would have 90 days to change the company name. They would immediately cease and desist all production and sale of the 4 patented products. They would issue a public statement to be published in every major business journal in the state, correcting the historical record of the company's founding and acknowledging my role as the sole founder and creator of the core business model. In return, I would waive all claims for damages incurred over the past week. Kevin stared at the papers, his face ashen. "But that's everything," he whispered. "The name, the products, that is the company. We'd have nothing left." "Precisely," Mr. Alden said coldly. Amber laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This is insane. We'll fight you in court." Mr. Alden met her gaze with a look of profound pity. "You could try," he said softly. "And we would immediately file an injunction to halt all sales during the litigation, which would likely take years. Your franchisees would abandon you, your credit lines would be frozen, and your company would be bankrupt within 6 months. My client has the time and the resources. You do not. Your lawyer knows this." He glanced at the man, who refused to meet his eyes and began shuffling his papers. Then Mr. Alden slid the second, thicker stack across the table. "Which brings us to option B, the restoration." He let them read the cover page. "A new licensing and royalty agreement." Kevin reached for it with a trembling hand. Amber leaned in, her eyes scanning the first page with fierce intensity. I watched their faces as Mr. Alden detailed the terms, each one a perfectly crafted nail in the coffin of their stolen legacy. "First," he said, "Miss Vance will be reinstated to the board of directors as chairwoman, with ultimate veto power over all strategic decisions." Amber's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with hatred. "Second," he continued, unfazed, "the company will enter into a new, formal licensing agreement for the trademark and the patented recipes. The royalty fee for this license will be 51% of the net profit on every single item sold that bears the company name or uses a patented recipe." Kevin made a choking sound. 51%? That's control. "That is the correct price for the foundation of your entire empire," I said, speaking for the first time since the presentation began. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "And third, Mr. Alden said, delivering the killing blow. "Within 6 months, all product packaging must be redesigned. On the front of every box, bag, and container, beneath the company name, The following text must be displayed in a font size no less than 12 point, based on the original recipes and business model of founder Eleanor Vance. That was it, the checkmate. It wasn't just about money or control. It was about the truth. It was about my name, my legacy, being indelibly etched onto every single piece of their success. They would not just be paying me, they would be advertising my story for me. Every customer who picked up a box of what they thought was their product would be holding the story of my triumph in their hands. Amber's rebranding, her entire effort to write me out of history, would be undone, and her work would now be the vehicle for my permanent recognition. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was the silence of absolute, unequivocal defeat. Kevin broke first. He dropped his head into his hands, and a sob escaped his lips. A raw, ragged sound of a man utterly broken. "I'm sorry, Mom," he wept. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry." Amber did not move. She stared at me, her face a terrifying blank canvas of pure, impotent rage. She knew she had lost. She had played for an empire and had been demoted to a highly paid manager in my company. Her name would never be on the box. Mine would. Mr. Alden placed a single elegant fountain pen on the table between them. "You have 1 hour to confer with your counsel and make your decision." He stood up. "Eleanor and I will be in my office." We left them in that silent, sterile room with their ruin. We didn't need the full hour. 20 minutes later, their lawyer knocked softly on Mr. Alden's door. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped. "They will sign option B," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We returned to the conference room. The documents were laid out, opened to the final page. The pen lay beside them. Kevin was still weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. Amber's face was like stone. Mr. Alden pointed to the signature line. "Mr. Vance, as CEO, you will sign first." With a hand that shook so badly he could barely hold the pen, my son signed his name. He slid the document over to Amber. For a moment, I thought she would refuse. She stared at the pen, as if it were a venomous snake. Then, with a sudden, vicious movement, she snatched it up and scrawled her signature, a jagged, angry wound on the page. It was done. Mr. Alden gathered the signed copies. I stood up, my chair making no sound on the thick carpet. I looked at my son, still weeping, and at his wife, who was radiating a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. I felt nothing for them. No pity, no anger, no lingering love. They were simply a problem that had been solved, a column in a ledger that had finally been balanced. I walked to the door, my steps steady and sure. As I reached for the handle, I paused and looked back at them one last time. "By the way," I said, my voice cool and clear, "the new packaging. I want the final design on my desk for approval in 30 days. Welcome back to my company." Then I walked out, leaving them behind with the truth. My triumph wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet. It was absolute. And it was written in ink, on a legally binding contract. It was the cold, satisfying click of a well-laid plan snapping perfectly into place. Victory is not a destination. It is a transition. The moment I walked out of Mr. Exter, Alden's conference room, leaving the wreckage of my son's ambition and his wife's arrogance behind me, I did not feel a surge of triumph. I felt a profound and sudden quiet. The quiet of a long overdue debt finally being paid, of a complex equation finally being solved. The war was over. The question that remained was what to do with the peace. 6 months later, the first royalty check arrived. It was delivered not to my home, but to a modest, sunlit office in a renovated downtown building. The name on the frosted glass of the door did not read Eleanor's Finest. It read, The Vance Foundation. Mr. Alden, now the chairman of my foundation's board of trustees, sat opposite me at a simple oak table. The office smelled of fresh paint, brewing coffee, and old books, a scent of new beginnings and established wisdom. He slid the envelope across the table. It was heavy, made of thick, creamy paper, bearing the corporate logo of the company I had founded, my name, in their stylized font. I opened it. The check was for an amount so large it seemed abstract, a string of zeros that had lost all connection to the physical world of flour and sugar. It was the financial result of millions of sales, of a brand operating at peak efficiency, now with a new, legally mandated story to tell on every box. I looked at the number, and I felt nothing of the greed or satisfaction that might have consumed another. I saw not a personal fortune, but fuel, raw, powerful fuel for a new kind of engine. I picked up a pen, turned the check over, and endorsed it with a simple, steady signature. Beneath my name, I wrote, for deposit only to the account of the Vance Foundation. I slid it back to Mr. Alden. He looked at the endorsed check, then at me, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. I thought you might do that, he said. The first grant committee meeting is next Tuesday. We have 17 worthy applications. 17, I repeated softly. How many of them were told their ideas were charming? At least a dozen, he replied, his smile widening. It seems to be a common theme. I never set foot in the corporate headquarters of Eleanor's Finest again. I had no desire to. As chairwoman of the board, I attended quarterly meetings via video conference, my face a calm, impassive presence on a large screen in their glass-walled boardroom. I voted on budgets, reviewed expansion plans, and occasionally exercised my veto power, always with a brief, surgically precise explanation rooted in market data, not emotion. I was a ghost in their machine, the silent, invisible force that took 51% of their profits and directed the company's grand strategy. They were running my company for me, and they were running it very, very well. Their desperation to generate enough profit to make their remaining 49% meaningful had made them more efficient and more ruthless than ever before. Their lives, from what I could gather, had become a gilded cage. They had the wealth, the status, the beautiful apartment, but it was all hollow. They were sharecroppers on land that I owned outright. The proof was unavoidable, a constant, public reminder of their defeat. I saw it firsthand at Thanksgiving. I had decided to attend for the sake of my grandchildren, who were innocent of their parents' sins. I walked into their home, a place of cold, minimalist decor, and brought a simple bouquet of flowers from my garden. The atmosphere was thick, with a tension so profound it was almost a physical presence. Kevin was a caricature of a jovial host, his laughter a little too loud, his movements a little too quick. He avoided making eye contact with me for more than a second at a time. Amber was a statue of silent, brittle elegance. She spoke only when necessary, her voice a monotone, her smiles small, tight cuts of her crimson lips. She was a queen in a conquered kingdom, forced to entertain the true monarch. The final exquisite torture came with dessert. My granddaughter Lily ran into the kitchen and returned carrying the pie. "Grandma, look, we have your favorite," she announced proudly. She placed the box on the table, and there it was, the new packaging. A beautiful, matte-finished box with an elegant photograph of a perfect harvest apple pie. and beneath the familiar logo of Eleanor's Finest, the words, mandated by contract, printed in a tasteful but prominent serif font, based on the original recipes and business model of founder, Eleanor Vance. Amber froze, a knife in her hand, halfway through cutting the turkey. Kevin stared at the box, as if it were a bomb. My name, my title, an indelible mass-produced monument to their lie, sitting right in the center of their family table. They had to look at it. Their friends and colleagues had to look at it. Every customer in every grocery store in the country had to look at it. They were forced, daily, to sell the very truth they had tried so hard to bury. I smiled gently at my granddaughter. "That looks lovely, darling," I said, my voice warm and kind. "I'm so glad you're enjoying my legacy." Amber's hand tightened on the knife. The moment was perfect. But this sterile victory was not my life's work. It was merely the financing for it. My real work now took place in the sunlit office of the Vance Foundation. My purpose was no longer to reclaim my past, but to build a future for others. Our mission was simple and deeply personal. We provided seed capital grants to women entrepreneurs over the age of 50. Women with decades of experience, with brilliant, viable ideas, who were routinely dismissed by a venture capital world obsessed with 20-something men in hoodies. We invested in the overlooked, the underestimated, the women who were told their life's work was a cute hobby. The first woman we funded was named Maria Sanchez. She was 63 years old, a chemical engineer who had been laid off from a major textile firm 2 years prior. For her entire career, she had been working on a side project at home, a revolutionary, biodegradable fabric made from agricultural waste that was stronger, softer, and more water-resistant than anything on the market. She had a detailed business plan, working prototypes, and letters of interest from 2 small clothing designers. She had pitched her idea to more than 30 investors. They had all patted her on the head, called her research fascinating, and told her it was a lovely project for her retirement. She sat across from me at the oak table in my office, her hands nervously clasped around a worn leather briefcase containing her life's work. She was terrified, but her eyes held a fire of fierce intelligence that I recognized instantly. She gave her presentation with a quiet, professional passion. It was brilliant. The science was sound, the market analysis was sharp, the financial projections were conservative but compelling. It was a better plan than 90% of the ones I had reviewed in my corporate life. When she finished, she looked at me, bracing for the same gentle dismissal she had heard so many times before. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I simply looked at her, a woman of substance, of experience, who had been made to feel small and naive. "They told you it was a nice hobby, didn't they, Maria?" I asked softly. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. "They look at women like us, and they don't see architects. They see decorators," I said. "They see our experience not as an asset, but as an expiration date. They call our carefully laid plans quaint because they are terrified of the power in our patience." I pushed a document across the table. It was a grant award letter. The amount was for $250,000, enough to secure a lab, hire a small team, and begin initial production. She stared at the number, her hand flying to her mouth. Her shoulders began to shake as silent sobs of relief and vindication ran through her. "This isn't a gift, Maria," I said gently. "It's an investment. I'm not your benefactor. I'm your first partner. Now, let's talk about scaling your supply chain. I have some thoughts on that." That was my new life. Not board meetings and royalty statements, but this connection, this act of building. My legacy wasn't the bakery anymore. The bakery was just the bank. My true legacy was the Vance Foundation. It was Maria, and the woman after her who was creating a logistics software for rural farmers, and the woman after that who was designing ergonomic tools for elderly gardeners. On the wall of my office, there is only one photograph. It's not of me with my son at some corporate gala. It's a simple snapshot of Maria and me, standing in her new, gleaming laboratory. We are both laughing. She is holding a bolt of her revolutionary fabric, and I am holding the business plan that made it possible. I had not just reclaimed my name, I had repurposed it. It was no longer just the brand on a pie crust, a silent rebuke to my son. It was now a symbol of hope, a hallmark of second chances. My son and his wife still worked every day to build their empire, but they were no longer building it for themselves. They were building it for Maria and all the Mariahs to come. I was, at long last, free. Not free from them, but free of them. My past was settled, my present was purposeful, and my future was something I was building once again from the ground up. This time, I was building it for an entire generation of forgotten architects, and this legacy, I knew, could never be stolen.